Okay, it's about 2:15, so let's go ahead and get started. In case there's some confusion, I am Susan Mobley, so you're in the right place. The title is wrong, mainly because I changed my mind about what I wanted to talk about, and let me tell you why that is. I am a newcomer to 21st century classical education, but I spent an awful lot of time with it in many other centuries. So I was trying to figure out what I could share with you from my historical experience with classical education that would interest you. So we are going to focus on the Reformation, but we're going to take a kind of a step back to figure out how we got there. And the thing with studying education, particularly in the Reformation era, you have to know something about the Renaissance, you have to know something about the Middle Ages, and you have to know something about the classical period. Otherwise, what happens makes no sense. So by trade, I am a Reformation historian, but what I really am is a historian of education. So my specialty field is in the Reformation, but as I said, to understand that, you kind of have to have a broad view. One of the things that's always interested me is the connection between church and state, and education is a great way of seeing a profound shift in European society that really continues to impact us today. So that's what I want to walk you through. So we're going to start with some context. And then I want to give you a specific example of what's going on in Württemberg. And in case no one knows where Württemberg is, I know Stephen does because he just had me in class. Okay, I'm going to have to leave the microphone, I'm sorry. It's right there. So if you look at this map and it's color-coded confessionally, what do you notice? The green areas are Catholic. The purple areas are Calvinist. The Lutheran areas are yellow. Okay, I'm going to have to hold this. I talk with my hands, and so that's why I didn't want to pick up the microphone, but I don't like to stand in place either. So, okay, so you might notice from this map that we have a whole lot of Catholic areas. Most of our Lutheran areas are centered in the northern part of what is today Germany. I'm going to explain that in just a second. This is the only Lutheran area in Germany in the 16th century, and it's surrounded by Calvinists and Catholics. So this is going to affect a lot of the Reformation in Württemberg, and particularly how its educational system was structured. So I wanted to kind of orient you first to where we are. Then I want to give you a little context for education in this particular period. Louis Spitz once said that there is no other era in Western civilization that was more interested in education than this particular era and our own. And there are reasons for that, which I will touch on as we go through. As several presenters have alluded to, Luther and Melanchthon, well, they're formidable intellects in their own right, but trying to put them in a category is really difficult. So Luther is essentially trained in a medieval system of education, but he is going to be influenced by strains of humanism coming up from Renaissance Italy. Melanchthon is younger, so he's still receiving a more or less medieval education, but it's much more strongly influenced by humanism. So really, when they got down to their educational theories, they're neither medieval nor Renaissance. And I have a chart here in just a second. I'm going to explain this. So one of the primary tasks of the reformers, if you want to spread the gospel to generations, well, you have to start them young, and you have to be able to replicate the system generation after generation. So the best way to do that is education. So we got to figure out how to do it. All right. So when I talked about Luther was trained in a medieval way, and we have these strains of humanism coming up from Renaissance Italy, this is kind of a simplistic chart of education. So I want to ask you some questions about the content, the subjects, and then I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of education in these two particular eras. So first of all, if you look at these subject lists, what do you notice? You didn't know this was going to be interactive, did you? Do you notice any similarities? What do you see? What's that? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, and so these are not necessarily listed in a progressive order. They're just kind of kind of thrown up there. Do you notice that Latin shows up on both lists? Okay, that's still going to be the core subject in both educational systems, even though medieval Latin is absolutely dreadful. What else do you notice? Anything similar? Can you see over there? Do people want to move so they can actually see? Because I'm going to actually refer to this PowerPoint.
Rhetoric and dialectic.
Yes, rhetoric and dialectic show up on both. You'll notice that in the left column it's called dialectic and on the right it's called logic. Anybody know why? It's essentially the same subject. Dialectic is more akin to rhetoric. So really what you're trying to do is persuade. And sometimes to be able to do that, you have to be able to argue both sides of a question. So you'll notice, let's talk about differences then. Those might be more apparent. Yep, and you don't see it in the medieval, right? Okay. What else? Natural philosophy, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Moral philosophy. Poetry. And Dr. Veith just talked about the importance of literature, and poetry is actually in this list for the very reasons you were talking about. Okay, so let me ask you this question. And it's really hard to summarize medieval education because it starts, I mean, one could argue it starts with Augustine, though Augustine's one of those figures that's neither classical nor medieval. So let's just say ballpark 500 AD. And it goes until probably around 1500. Okay, so quick math check. How long is that? It's 1,000 years. And it's a very diverse period. So 500 AD in Europe is very different from 1500 AD. So in the beginning, medieval education, if you wanted an education in the Middle Ages, where did you go? If you're in 550 AD and you want to learn something, where do you go? There you go. So what is the purpose of education for the front part of the Middle Ages?
Serve God.
To serve God, and we do that by how? Look at the list. What are we doing? What do we need to know?
Latin, Greek, history, philosophy.
Not on this column. We're going to be looking on that column. We'll get back to that. You need to know the 7 liberal arts. Okay, that's like a classical designation. There's still an argument exactly who came up with it, but it's definitely classical. I mean, Greeks and Romans classical. So what we're trying to do is to preserve classical learning. So you have to think about the monasteries of outposts of civilization amid the falls of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is in ruins. It takes people a while to realize, hey, it's gone. It's when the aqueducts start crumbling and the roads start falling into disrepair, they're like, oh, there's no Rome. So what the early monks then are really trying to do is to preserve classical learning. And if we were here, we should all give them a big hug because they preserved all the classical texts that we have today were preserved by the monks. They copied them, they kept them in their scriptoria. Bede is probably one of the more famous of the early monks. He is in a monastery way up north in England at Yarrow. But he was a great pen pal. He had friends all over Europe, and they would trade manuscripts. So one monastery would send him manuscripts. They would make a copy of it and send it back. So it's like interlibrary loan, except you made a copy of it before you sent it back. So this is where all our texts are being preserved. So as we go through the Middle Ages, what do we need to do? So if we're in 1300, what do we need our education to do? We need people to teach people about the church, what we believe, who's in charge, why it's structured the way it is, right? So monks serve the ideal life. Not everyone can live like a monk, so they're your ideals. But they're supposed to serve as an example, and the clergy, remember, they're shepherds of the flock, so they have to be able to teach people about religion. But again, if you look at our list, what do you not see on this list? I'm talking about the column on the right. No history, And there's a really, really important historical book for Christians. Scripture! Not on the list! Yeah, Luther did the same thing. He couldn't quite understand this. So what we're reading are church fathers, theologians, philosophers, and there's a very fine line between philosophers and theologians in the Middle Ages. Sometimes one crossed the line and there was a big debate, but there's a lot of interchange between those two. So basically, we're still preparing people for service to the church. But again, if the church is the only one who can produce educated people, they're going to get drafted by the state. So sometimes they're going to end up in what we think of as the secular world. Now, the other thing that you want to keep in mind about medieval education, it is not public. It is not universal. Only a very, very, very small percentage of the population received an education. Most, even if you went to university, which were created in the 12th century, by the way, you didn't complete a degree because you couldn't afford it. So most only went there for a short time, got a smattering of learning, which they can then use to advance in whatever career ladder they were on, which mainly was in the church. All right, when we get to the Renaissance, we have had a lot of developments in society, economics, and politics. So I'm talking here specifically about Renaissance Italy. Does anyone know anything about Renaissance Italy in terms of politics, society, or economy? What was the primary economic activity in Renaissance Italy? Does anybody know? Trade, commerce. What do you need to know? Money, math, reading, writing. So basically reading and writing and arithmetic. That's what you need to know. What was the prevailing political system in Renaissance Italy? That's just a trick question. There wasn't one. But essentially we're returning to classical models. So in the Renaissance, the word itself means rebirth. What is being reborn is classical culture. If you go back to the Greeks and the Romans, both of them thought in terms of self-government. Now, the Romans had a republic where they elected people to represent them, but the political power always belonged to the people. So if we're talking about Renaissance Italy and we have all these cities which are primarily engaged in commerce, and the citizens are running their own cities, what do you need to know in order to function in that society? How to speak, how to persuade, count. If you're making laws, is it important to know about people? Like human nature, morality? If you are making laws, don't you need to know something about how it was done in the past? So can you see that our Renaissance education is designed for a different society than the medieval one? So we need to produce active citizens who can speak well and who have a strong moral compass. Now, where does that moral compass come from? It's in a Christian context, but we're going to be using classical texts in order to enhance it. So they read Cato a lot, for example. They read Cicero, De Officiis, right? All right, so can you see that we have a fairly profound shift in education between the medieval period and the Renaissance period? Okay, it's at that same juncture that the Reformation happens. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, so if we look at just the broad characteristics of Lutheran education, these are they. And for any of you Lutheran educators in the room, this list should look really familiar. So what the reformers, and I'm talking here principally about Luther and Melanchthon, but you could argue about other reformers as well. What they really did is to take the seven liberal arts of the Middle Ages and combine it with the Renaissance program of education. Because of Luther's stress on the priesthood of all believers and the primacy of Scripture, everyone needed to be educated. So what Luther advocated for and really tried to establish was universal education. Now, it wasn't realized, but that was the ultimate goal. For them, both Luther and Melanchthon, education was a foundation of faith. They also viewed it, and Luther stopped writing about education around 1527. That's really the last time we see him specifically address this at length. Most of the work thereafter was done by Melanchthon. But in that you can see a concern for the two kingdoms. That the work of the church and the work of the schools was inseparable. We also want, again, unlike the medieval education, which is really preparing people for one career track, that's the church, in Lutheran terms, Luther understood that we all have vocations. We are all called into something specific by God, and therefore we need to be prepared for whatever that calling is. And that's why education is so important for everybody. He even believed that shoemakers and butchers should know Latin. I mean, because what if the clergy get wiped out? Somebody's got to be able to read the scriptures. And then again, this accessibility of education that I talked about. Okay, so as most of you know, Luther, his theology starts off as an implicit and then becomes an explicit criticism of contemporary education. But he's really thinking about it, at least initially, in terms of, oh my gosh, everyone's theology is all wrong. We've got to fix this. Then comes the realization of, well, theology, okay, let me pause for a second. The way universities were organized in this particular period, there are 4 faculties. You can think of them like departments. There are 3 upper faculties, law, medicine, and theology. So think of those as like graduate level. Then you have something called the Faculty of Arts. You could think about it as that's the undergraduate program. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough. So if you fix theology, the studies of theology, and again, what are we emphasizing in Lutheran theology? What do students need to be able to do in order to study Lutheran theology? What's the first thing they have to know? Scripture. And in what languages? Greek and Hebrew. All right, but they're studying theology in the Faculty of Theology. So they should already be equipped to read those languages by the time they get into theology. So what problem immediately becomes apparent? The students aren't prepared for those advanced studies. So we have to go back and fix the arts program, because if we don't fix the arts program, our students won't be prepared for these higher level studies. And then once you change the arts program, it's also going to affect law and medicine, because again, the arts program is the foundation for these higher studies. Is everyone following me? Okay, and law changes to, Lutherans didn't have much use for canon law, unless they were arguing with Catholics, and then they needed to know. Okay, so step 1 then is university level. And we kind of start at the top and kind of work our way down. Then what was happening is, if we are establishing a curriculum that focuses on languages, Latin, classical Latin, not medieval Latin, Greek and Hebrew, we're going to have to take a running start at this. We can't wait till they get to the university and start teaching them these languages. Any of you adult learners who've started learning a foreign language, tell me how that's gone. It's really hard, right? Kids are like sponges. They don't have to work really hard to learn a foreign language. The older you get, the harder it is. And if you really want to be conversant in scriptures, so that you understand implicitly what the text is saying to you in the original language, you have to start early. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an intermediate level of instruction. In the 16th century, it's called the Pedagogium. This is really the forerunner of the German gymnasium, which is a model that Lutherans brought with them from Germany to North America in the 19th century. So it's basically college preparatory. And then step 3 is, so in order to get students ready for the Pedagogium, which is going to get students ready for the university, we have to fix the elementary level of education. So there's more of them, but these are the 3 main ones. The Trivialschulen, if you look at the beginning of that word, trivial, trivium, 7 liberal arts. Remember the trivium from the 7 liberal arts? So the primary subject there is Latin. They're also called Lateinschulen. We still have monastic schools, and I'm going to give you an example in Württemberg about how they operated. And then municipal schools are schools that are operated by cities, but many of them are, at least if we're talking in the German context, they're German language schools. So they're not designed for people going to university. They're designed to prepare people for things like being a merchant or a shopkeeper or something like that. So it would be, this is the reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it would be in German. So I'm going to tell you how this all worked out. So one of the things that I've noticed in my study of education, and part of this is informed by my own career. I'm a historian. I'm an educator. I'm an historian of education. I'm a department chair. I'm a co-chair of the Core Curriculum Revision Committee. I'm a faculty marshal. I am worried about logistics. Ideas are one thing, but there is a huge difference between what something looks like on paper and getting it implemented on the ground level. So this is one of the things that I'm tracking in the Duchy of Württemberg. We have this shift in education, but what did it look like on a more practical level? So I'm still kind of peeling the layers of the onion, but I'm gonna kind of give you an overview of what I've found so far. I put up here, this is the coat of arms for the House of Württemberg, which in this particular period is a duchy. And I want to call attention, because I'm going to mention in just a second, I don't know if you can see up there by the little green feathery thing. You see where it says attempto? That's the motto for the family. It depends on which Latin translation you get. You can get I attack, I assail, or I fail. We'll see how that plays out. Okay. So the Reformation in Württemberg goes through some very interesting developments. And again, here's that difference between, okay, here's the ideas. We're Lutheran by theology. How do we implement this? So Württemberg has a very peculiar circumstance. It has to do with the guy on the right. This is Ulrich. Ulrich was a really interesting fellow. He spent most of his younger days attacking everybody else. In fact, he gets involved in a war. And as part of the war, the city of Bretten, which is Melanchthon's hometown, is put under siege for about 2 weeks. And as a consequence, Ulrich, that is going to acquire the monastery of Maulbronn, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So he's already made a bad name for himself within the Holy Roman Empire because he keeps trying to move in and take everybody else's territory. And then he gets into a brawl. He kills a guy because he wants the guy's wife. You couldn't make a better soap opera. And the last thing then is he attacks a free imperial city, which happens to be a member of the Swabian League, and that's the last straw. So as a result, Ulrich is kicked out of his duchy in 1519. The Habsburgs move in, and for those of you who don't know, the Habsburgs are probably the most important dynastic family in Europe in the 16th century. The head of the house, the Holy Roman Emperor at this particular juncture, is Charles V. Charles V did something that no other sovereign in European history did, and that is that he united in one person himself the crowns of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. Now, this becomes really important when you know what happened in 1492. So, who paid for that expedition? Who is going to reap the initial benefits of that expedition? Spain. So it's a powerhouse in this particular era, but they are really, really Catholic. Really Catholic. Okay, so the first thing that's going to happen when the Habsburgs take over Württemberg is they're going to make everything really Catholic. So we're going to roll the clock back about 300 years. So if you look at the University of Tübingen, which had at one point in time been a flowering center of humanism, it's going to be as scholastic as you can make it. So when Ulrich returns in 1534 with Protestant help, he himself is a Protestant, and he wants to institute Protestantism in Württemberg. He's obviously going to face a problem with the university because they're all Catholic. Now, the other thing you have to remember about universities in this particular period is they are institutions that are separate from the state. Okay, let's put this in context. So I heard mentioned in an earlier session about accreditation. What is that? So like, why would schools need to be accredited?
State approval
And why do you need that?
to get state money.
But really, it's so that you're telling people that the education that you're providing is good. It meets standards, right? It's acceptable. It's okay to send your kids here, right? Well, the same is true for university education. If you go to a university in Germany and you decide that you want to go get a job in France, why would your degree be valid? Because what?
Your professor.
Yes, but where does the authority for the professors come from? There's only one universal authority in Europe. It's the Pope. It's the Pope. So every university in Europe is basically operates under a charter by the Pope. So there's a papal bull way back in the beginning that establishes the university. And so the university confers degrees by the authority of the Pope. And usually the person who holds that authority is the chancellor. Right? Okay. So this might seem like a simple problem to fix, but in Württemberg, we have a Catholic chancellor who refuses to step down, and he doesn't die until 1561. So this becomes an immediate problem for Protestant universities. How do our degrees, how are they valid if we don't have the universal authority of the Pope to give them merit, to give them value? So we're going to have to figure out a whole new system of accrediting our institutions. So that's where that connection between church and state begins to develop. And I'm going to show you how this plays out in Württemberg. Okay. All right. So Ulrich returns to Württemberg in 1534. We institute Protestantism. We have one little problem. Ulrich is Protestant, but he's not really particularly theologically interested. So he likes Zwinglianism because the Swabian cities helped him, and he likes Lutherans because his cousin Philip of Hesse helped him get his duchy back. So he does the really brilliant thing of dividing the duchy in half. The Lutherans get the north, the Zwinglians get the south. Yeah, how's that going to work? Yeah, not well. So in other words, ideas and practical applications are affected by the context. It's affected by the situation. So Ulrich is going to call in a consultant, a fairly well-known educational consultant in the period. His name is Philip Melanchthon, to help advise him on reforming the university. Because of the conflict with the Zwinglians, Melanchthon can't come in an official capacity. But he has a friend, Camerarius. Joachim Camerarius is one of his friends who's actually teaching at Tübingen at this time. So on the pretext of visiting his friend, Melanchthon comes to Tübingen, that's where the university in Württemberg is located, and gives him some advice on reforming the university and the curriculum. Melanchthon is going to bring in a friend of his, Johannes Brenz, who's a theologian. So he's going to work on reforming the theology part of the university, and he does a few other things. And then, as I mentioned before, remember the step 1, the step 2, the step 3? So it's not enough to fix the university, we have to fix all those other levels as well. And how I did is attempto. I attack, I fail. It really means try. So it didn't succeed, and the reasons it didn't succeed are these. So we had this little war. It's called the Schmalkaldic War. It goes through different phases. One is 1546 to 1548. That was ended with the Augsburg Interim in 1548. Now, here's the problem for Württemberg. Remember when Ulrich got kicked out of his duchy in 1519? And he got returned in 1534? There were strings. The Habsburgs said, okay, fine, you can have it back, but you are our vassals. We are your liege lord. So the Schmalkaldic War is a war between the Protestants and the Catholics, headed by the Habsburgs. So Württemberg then is in trouble on a multiple levels. It has to pay a war indemnity. It has occupation forces. And there are imperial proceedings against Ulrich because he violated his oath. How do you think this is going to affect education? It's going to make it very difficult to get any reforms through, because if you're a Habsburg, the last thing you want is for a duchy to not only go Lutheran, but to establish an effective system of education to produce more Lutherans, right? So they're going to throw whatever roadblocks the way they can. And again, one thing that we know about education, it does cost money. There is an investment with education. And if Württemberg is paying a war indemnity, how much additional funding do we have? Not much. So we have another round of war, and basically, Peace of Passau is basically a timeout. The main peace came in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. This is extremely important because what it's going to do, more or less, it's going to recognize Lutheranism. It's really the adherence to the Augsburg Confession as legal. So they have legal standing within the empire. It's also going to allow rulers to choose the religion of their realm. So if you're the Duke of Bavaria and you're Catholic, you have the legal right to make everybody in Bavaria Catholic. If you're the Duke of Württemberg and you're Lutheran, you have the full right to make everybody in your duchy Lutheran. So it's no surprise that we're going to see our greatest advances in educational reform after 1555 in the Duchy of Württemberg. The other reason is this guy. Doesn't he look really German? This is Christoph. He is considered one of the two greatest rulers in Württemberg. And I put up here this German. It's so hard to translate this. Landesvater. It means, I mean, you could translate it father of the country, but that doesn't really convey what it means. So Christoph views himself as a Christian ruler whose responsibility it is not only to maintain peace in his realm, but to protect the church and to spread the gospel. So everything that he does is in that lens. So we have to do two things. First of all, we have to establish a state church. The main architect of that is Johannes Brentz. Then we have to establish a state system of schools. His chief advisor there is a guy named Michael Taxites. And I'm going to walk you through two documents that came out of that, the University Ordinance of 1557 and the Grosse Kirchenordnung of 1559. If you translate this, you get great or large church ordinance. And it was great. It was 568 pages. That's the title page. There's a whole bunch of stuff in that. Really, the only thing I'm going to talk about is what it said about education. But just be aware that this document also established a state church, and it serves as the model for other Protestant states within Germany. So there's a whole section in the Grosse Kirchenordnung that is about education. And if you read the document, you can tell it's based upon visitations and observations. So in other words, they have these ideas of what they want to do, but their ideas are based upon practical experience of what's going on now. So in other words, you can tell in the document the problems, the challenges that they see. So the solutions they come up with are in response to particular things that they're seeing. There are 4 distinct types of schools that are identified in this document. And what the document is going to do for the first time is to establish the relationship between those schools. So if you go back into the Middle Ages, you have all these schools, but it's not clear how they relate to each other or how their curriculums either interact or don't react or overlap or don't overlap. So we're going to fix that problem. So remember the step 1, the step 2, the step 3 that I talked about? We're going to then be very careful. Okay, if you're in the Partikularschulen, the Lateinschulen, this is what you're going to study. If you're in the Pädagogium, this is what you're going to study. If you're at the university, this is what you're going to study. Okay. And again, Latin grammar remains the core subject. And what we're seeking is, and this is very German, standardization. We want things to be clearly articulated, and we want it to be standardized. And I'm going to give you an example of how that worked. How long do I have? I forgot. Okay. All right, so if we look then at how education in Wittenberg worked, again, it's that step 1, step 2, step 3 that I talked about earlier. You start at the Trivialschulen, which in this document are called Partikularschulen. For the first time, we're going to organize into 5 classes that are based upon achievement level. So you start at the first class, then you go to the second class, and then you go to the third class, fourth class, fifth class. And I think this came up in the morning session about social promotion. We don't promote based upon time. We promote based upon mastery of material. Then we're going to clearly articulate how you go from the Partikularschulen to the Pedagogium. Oh, I should talk about the monastic schools. What's going to happen in Wittenberg, and they actually do it first, and everyone else thinks this is such a wonderful idea that it's replicated elsewhere. You have these monasteries. They're lovely buildings. This is Malbrunn. Remember I told you that the monastery that was taken over by Ulrich? There it is. This is actually where Kepler studied. Johannes Kepler studied there. We're going to turn these monasteries into boarding schools, but we're going to do it for scholarship students, and these students are really intended for theological studies. So these are going to be our pastors. These are going to be our theologians. These are going to be our church officials. So how you get into this is you take a test, you perform well on the test, and you get a free ride. So you're going to go from the monastic schools to the Pedagogium. In Württemberg, there are 2. There's a Pedagogium in Stuttgart, which is the capital, and then there's one in Tübingen where the university is. And they're slightly different, mainly because the Pedagogium at Tübingen is more closely connected to the university. But we're going to outline how you get from here to here. And then we're going to articulate how you get from here to university. And notice what you have to know. Because if you don't know Latin, you won't understand a word of lecture when you get to university, because everything is in Latin. We're also going to start you on Greek. So in the Pedagogium, you're going to start learning Greek. So, and again, it's so when you get to university, you're not like, you can follow the lectures. So the subtitle of my presentation was Teaching Truth in Latin Grammar. So it's interesting in this Große Kirchenordnung, and it's really specific actually about how to teach certain subjects, and I have an example I think on another slide. But we're also interested in teaching truth. So wrapped through the curriculum, it's constant references to Scripture, knowing how to read Scripture, the Catechism. There's a whole section in it called Gottesfurcht, which I have a slide for that too. It's basically fear of God. And as the psalm goes, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it's also going to need to stipulate what's important about our education. So one of the things that we think is really important is those languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And Latin grammar is really, really important. There is a whole special edition of this Große Kirchenordnung. If the original is 568 pages, this one had to be even longer because it's going to convey very specific instructions to teachers how to teach and what to teach, particularly in terms of Latin grammar. I mean, we've got declensions, we've got conjugations, we've got tenses, we've got mood, we have voice, we have parts of speech. Everything is stipulated by this document. All right, so if you look at the Partikularschulen, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the Partikularschulen. And again, what you should see here, Latin grammar. So we're going to start with the alphabet. We're going to start with vowels and consonants, pronunciation, vocabulary. And then we're going to work our way up to parts of speech, conjugating, declining, spelling, etymology. And working in with that, we're going to have moral instruction, music, and notice that the catechism is in German. Everything else is in Latin. In fact, the teachers are specifically instructed not to speak in the student's mother tongue. but in Latin at all times, except catechism. Why would that be? Yes, because they're going to get some catechetical instruction at home, and we want to make sure they understand it, right? So we're going to do it in German, which is going to reinforce the instruction they're getting at home. So here's what remember I told you how the specific instructions were? Here's an example. Now remember, this document was written by the state. You see how specific that is? So they're using the Pater Noster, that's the Lord's Prayer, which all the students should know. By the time they get to school, they should have that memorized, so they should know it. And then they're going to take it apart. They're going to start with something the kids know, and then they're going to work them through it, starting with the alphabet, then vowels, consonants, and pronunciation. They emphasize pronunciation a lot, so the students could pronounce things properly. So the teacher was supposed to model all this for them. And then as you see in the third and fourth classes, we get more, again, it builds upon the previous level. So because we know what's going on in the first class, we can develop the curriculum of the second class to match that. Because we know what's going on in the second class, we can develop the curriculum of the third class and all the way on up. And so you notice we're going to start adding Greek. And what we're really interested in is the students mastering Latin. Not only being able to read it, but also to write it and to speak it. Most students, if you were going to be college bound, you would complete the third class, and then you would move on to the Pedagogium. If you completed your entire career at the Partikularschulen, it probably meant you weren't going to go to college, at least immediately. So this should have been all the instruction you needed for whatever vocation you were going in. And again, you have to remember that even though this is intended as universal education, it's public education. It's mandated by the state. It's funded by the state. It's overseen by the state. It's accredited by the state. We're still talking about a fairly small percentage of the population that's going to be able to take advantage of it. And a lot of that just has to do with economics. So there's another section in this document that, again, you can see that it's very important that the students learn something about theology and faith, even if they're not going to be a pastor or a theologian. So it's integrated into their school day. So there's some operation at each point in the day that has to do with religious instruction. And you'll notice that a lot of it has to do with music. So they want the students to be able to sing the hymns, to sing the liturgy. It's interesting too, this last one is kind of funny. It kind of reminds me of confirmation class. So the students have to go to the service, they have to pay attention to the sermon, and the teachers are going to make sure of that because they're going to ask them questions about it afterwards. So we're constantly checking what students are learning. Okay, I just had to show you this. Tübingen is such a lovely city. This is Tübingen. This is called the Altstadt. This is the old part of the city. Do you see this structure here? You can see the spire sticking up there. This is called the Stiftskirche. This is attached to the university. So even today, if you would go to Tübingen, the regular pastor is going to be a member of the theology department at the university. So there's still that close connection. So again, the Pedagogium is replicating what we see at the Partikularschulen, just at a higher level. And when we get up into here, they are going to be taking college classes. So this is kind of like dual credit, 16th century style. So these are students in the Pedagogium. That's where they're matriculated. But they can attend public lectures at the university. So they're going to be hearing Greek, Virgil, and then I think in the fourth class, all of those subjects I've listed here are basically college level courses. Now, the difference is in the Pedagogium, at the end of the day, you go back to, and the Pedagogium is, you can think of it like a residence college. You would go back at the end of the day and you have tutors that review you to make sure that you understood what happened during the day and to sort of reinforce lessons. So it's kind of like structured homework with a supervisor. And then every half year, notice, again, this is something we have to understand logistics. We do have printing now. That's wonderful. Textbooks are much cheaper. We have paper, which is much cheaper than parchment, but it doesn't mean that it's cheap. So writing materials are still fairly prized. So we can't have a lot of student papers. I mean, literally like papers, because it's just too expensive. So how do we examine the students to make sure that they're learning, that they're comprehending the material? Well, you do it orally. So every 6 months, the students are going to be orally examined. The pedagogue is the head of the pedagogium. And then notice who else is showing up for the examinations. Now, okay, if you're a student, and you probably would have been maybe 16 or 17 this time, and all these people showed up in official regalia, how would you feel? You would make darn sure you were ready for that exam, right? Okay, so I'm going to close with this. I'm not going to translate this whole thing. For Neues Hochdeutsch is, well, it kind of eats my lunch sometimes because they never follow any rules. It's really aggravating. Okay, basically what this is saying is, and here's the key line. Ausbreitung Gottes der rechten wahren Religion und Glaubens der allgemeinen christlichen Nutzen. So basically for the glory of God, the expansion of the gospel, and the glory of Christ. This is why we do education. God has ordained education. The schools have been ordained by God as the best means of preparing students, not only in religion, but in all these various areas. State office, teaching, whatever vocation you're in. That's what the schools are designed to do for Christians. And then, and the reason I mention this is there's a lot of, I mean, everyone in the 16th century purports to have a Christian education, and a lot of this particular model of education is based upon a famous academy in Strasbourg that was, it was started by a man named Jakob Sturm. But what you don't find in Sturm is a confessional identity. You do in the church ordinance of 1559. And this is from the university ordinance. Here's the key part right here. We're going to have all of our university professors, no matter what faculty they're in, they are going to have to sign off on the Augsburg Confession because the Augsburg Confession is a true representation of apostolic teaching and scripture. It's a faithful representation of those. So all our professors are going to have to adhere to it. And we're not going to tolerate any, I love this, verworfener Sekten and sakramentierer Lehre. No sacramentarians. No squishy Protestant type people. And certainly no Catholics. So again, this is coming from the state. So there is a very close connection between church and state and education in the 16th century. And this kind of, as classical educators, this is something that might seem strange to you because it seems like you're fighting against the state all the time. But really the origins of public education as we know it come from the Reformation and they come from the state, working in collaboration with the church. Okay, do we have any quick questions or comments?
If you read in Luther's works, I think it's under Career of the Reformer or something, there are visitation articles for electoral Saxony from about 1525 or so. Mm-hmm. This led to Luther wanting a catechism. Mm-hmm. But there's also detailed curriculum guidelines. And Melanchthon was known as the teacher of Germany. Mm-hmm. So great interest in education.
Yeah, and again, because they have to, the ideas are great, that's one thing, but you have to figure out a way to implementing them. And another thing that's going to happen, it happens all over Germany, but in Württemberg, they have regular visitations. So they go out and look at not only, so you have people not only going to the parishes, but you have people going to the schools. And they're examining what's going on in the schools and making sure that the curriculum is what it should be and the teachers are properly prepared and that everything is working. Anything else? All right, thank you very much.